Good afternoon, hello, and welcome everyone to Climate and Human Rights, Multiple Connections, Multiple Solutions. Now, this is a COP27 event organized by the German Federal Foreign Office to emphasize the connection between climate action on the one hand and human rights on the other hand, and then especially for the most vulnerable groups. So, in other words, today will all be about ambition and solidarity to make sure that we put human rights issues at the very center of climate policy. Now, I want to start off by thanking you all. I see that we came here in great numbers, so thank you very much for taking your time out of what can be very busy and bustling days here to make time to attend this event and, emphasize the importance of it. That is also a very warm welcome to our online audience. So, from whichever part of the world you are watching from, we want to give you a very warm welcome here at the German Pavilion at COP27. Now, for those of you wondering, my name is Hajer Koubi. I'm 22 years old. I'm a former UN Youth Representative for the Netherlands, co-founder of Network 2100, but above all, very honored to be your moderator for today. Now, I am also a firm believer that the best sessions are the most interactive ones, so I want to rest you all assured that there will be room at the end of the event for questions, but let's also make space for each other so that we can ask as many of them as possible towards the end. Now, with that being said, I would like to call forward our very first guest. She will have to leave a little bit earlier because of negotiations, a lot of obligations, but she found this important topic so important that she wanted to make sure that she has time to be here and speak with you all. So can I get a big round of applause and a very warm welcome to Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock, the Federal German Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much. Hi, good seeing you, Minister Baerbock. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minister Baerbock. It's amazing to have you here, and we're going to be engaging in a discussion together with each other today, a dialogue, and to do that we have some other speakers in our midst, so I would actually also like to invite them forward right away. So if we can also get a big round of applause for Ralph Regenvanu, Vanuatu's Minister of Climate Change. Thank you so much for being here as well. You can sit right there. Then we also have Richard Pearshouse, who is the Director of the Environment and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. A big round of applause as well for Richard.
Thank you for the
Amazing to have him here. We have one more guest, Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, who's the founder of the Association of Indigenous Women and Peoples in Chad. She's making her way here, so hopefully we'll have her later on in the event. So if you see another guest joining in, you'll know it's Hindu, and she'll be here to share all her expertise she has on Indigenous rights. So very pleased also to hopefully have her with us later on. Now, with that being said, I'd like to turn to you, Minister Baerbock, because we've gathered here today to speak about the importance of making that interlinkage between human rights and climate action. And I would actually like to give you the floor. I know you have to leave, so that's why I want to go to you first to perhaps share some insights on your side on those topics.
Good afternoon and hello and welcome to everybody. I guess many of you have been already a couple of days here at the conference. For me, it was really important to start my negotiation parts here with these topics, because I truly believe, and unfortunately we have seen this in the last years, that the climate crisis is also the biggest threat for human rights. But also, on the other hand, without human rights, we couldn't fight the climate crisis. So they all belong to each other. They are just two sides of the same coin. And when I started my term as a foreign minister, we had some questions. So why did you put now climate policy, foreign and climate policy to the Foreign Office? And I said, well, because if for many, many countries, this is the most important security issue because it threatens, most importantly, human rights, then it is obviously that the foreign minister of Germany or of any other country has to speak about it. If I want to protect human rights, I have to have ambitious climate policy, and therefore, as a new German government, we said this is not a topic for one ministry, this is a topic for the whole government. And I visited Palau, but my dear colleagues can obviously talk more intensively about it because it's their daily life. But for me, it was when I visited Palau, one of the smaller island states, and I saw with my same own eyes what it means to human rights if we don't come on the 1.5 degrees. This means the people living directly at the coastline will lose their home within not 30 years, but within 10, 12, 15 years. So they lose their right to live where they want to live. And we visited, or we passed by a hospital, and they said, well, also this hospital has to be relocated. So people would also lose their right to healthcare if we are not fighting climate change, or in this regard, if we are not putting the topic of loss and damage on the agenda. And this was also one of the reasons, for example, why we said as a German government, together with our EU partners, okay, we obviously have to speak also about loss and damage. And if we look also with regard to the question of security, we are facing a brutal war of Russia against Ukraine currently. So this takes a lot of our engagement and efforts. But again, if we look worldwide, globally, 3 times more people are being displaced because of the climate crisis than by war. So it's really also a question of the right to life. And this is why I think we not only have to discuss how we can combine the two topics, but they are the same when we speak about climate change and human rights. And on the other hand, I also see many young people here, and great that you are one of the young global leaders. I hope there are also some Germans, which we supported from our ministries, but it's great that you took the job here for us in the German Pavilion. But without an active civil society, without Fridays for Future, or they have different names in different countries, obviously we wouldn't be discussing here at this COP that we definitely have to come from 2.5, 2.6 to 1.5. We would be probably discussing again that we have to come from 3.5 down to 1.5. So we see, without an active civil society, without an engagement of youth, of people who are also sometimes critical. And now as a new foreign officer, I have the demonstration sometimes also in front of my ministry. But we need also this critical society to always reflect, can we do more? So I'm really thankful that we are here today having these discussions, but actually that climate justice has been one of the main slogans for international climate conferences, actually since I've been there over 10 years ago.
Wow, thank you so much. Can we get a round of applause for that, people? Thank you so much. Now, thank you so much for those words, Minister Baerbock. And I really do take from your message as well that it is this self-reflection, right, that is vital and at the core of tackling this climate crisis if we want to be able to do it. Now, I just want to go back to your story, because you also mentioned that for you, visiting Palau and seeing what happened there really struck you in the sense of seeing how vital and how at the core of the climate crisis we're talking about human rights. You mentioned several initiatives you're involved with. Where do you see the role of Germany in trying to improve sort of the nexus being made between human rights and climate crisis at home and abroad?
Well, I think there's so many parts that I would take too much time to answer all of them. For me, most importantly, is that there's not the one and only solution. Neither for climate change nor for human rights, obviously. So I would like to maybe point out at 3 parts. These kind of international conferences, they matter. I mean, we don't know what the result of this conference will be. Obviously, it will be not enough, unfortunately. So we have to do more also in the upcoming weeks. But it matters whether we find language on how we have a working plan on mitigation, or if we just reconfirm that in 2015 we already agreed that by 2050 industrialized countries have to phase out by fossil fuels. No, we have to have really a working timetable for the next 10 years, because we know every year, not only for the fishermen at Palau, but every year matters around the world. Yeah. On the other hand, I think all these texts and treaties, are not enough. And this is why I also invite those of you who said maybe at the end of the conference, but this is not enough, to look what these conferences are also about. These are big fairs about best practice and exchange. So people come here together, industry, and I remember that also with civil society we had a discussion, so is it okay that also industry is coming here, or energy companies, or the finance, insurance companies? And I think yes, because these conferences are also about bringing together partners. And luckily, we moved from 2015 in Paris to here in Sharm El-Sheikh. Not everywhere we had to go with our own targets, but we moved a lot with technical development. And we know that we need these innovation jumps. We know that we need a worldwide industrial revolution. So this is the second track. And you ask, what can we do as a German delegation here to offer energy and climate partnerships, where we say, okay, it's not about we made all the gain with our industrial products, and now we tell others, please don't have industry because this really harms the world. Right. But find solutions together, how we can build solar, wind energy instead of coal power plants, or in my point, I would say also nuclear power plants. How we can build steel production which is climate neutral, not only in Europe, but also in other countries. How do we have a production also with regard to closing and other issues, where we start from the beginning, say maybe it costs a bit more in the beginning of the investments. Yeah. So the question of mobilizing funding is also very crucial, and this is why we as Germany made different proposals for these partnerships, which I think they are crucial, but also we are more than happy and open that Barbados started also a debate on restructuring the global finance. Right. And I can say for my point that we as a German government are supporting it. And the third part, not to be too long, is again connecting of civil society, making platforms where civil society can come together and also fund directly from our side different projects. For example, we enabled that we are funding forest projects bigger than in the past. We have learned from Red Plus that we have to include indigenous people in these kind of projects, and this is one of our projects we also brought here. Yep. Because it's not only about saving CO2, but it's also about forestation worldwide.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I think those are three vital points, and thank you for shedding the perspective. I would like to also go over to you, if I can, Minister Regan-Vanu. Minister Baerbock already spoke about the impacts that she saw on small island states. And I want to turn to you first, because to have the potential loss of Vanuatu, the potential total loss of you as a country, your country, due to climate change. From that perspective, why would you say it's important that we make this interlinkage between human rights and the climate crisis?
Thank you, and thank you for the honor of being on this panel. Vanuatu has the distinction of being the most vulnerable country in the world according to the World Risk Index. So I really am speaking with the perspective of the vulnerable countries. For us, climate change is inextricably linked with human rights. And I just want to put it in these terms. We have the United Nations Charter, we have the Conventions on Human Rights, we have the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, we have numerous conventions we've signed that provide rights to people under international law that we've all signed up to. So in Vanuatu, we are a least developed country. We've just graduated from the least developed country category, less than 2 years ago. Oh. We're still increasing vulnerability in terms of the effects of climate change. So in terms of having a GDP that can cope with providing basic services to the population, we are now over 15% of the population's budget spent on climate adaptation, and we are paying for loss and damage already. Wow. So I come from a constituency where kids are not going to school because we cannot fund we cannot fund the schools. We cannot build the schools. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we have signed, which guarantees the right of a child to education, we cannot honor that because there's not enough funds. No. We try to access climate finance. Very, very difficult to do. We've in the last 10 years, we've had about 100 million worth of climate finance accessed. One tropical cyclone in 2020, the cost of it was 600 million. So in one event, we have many, many more times the amount of climate finance we've been able to access.
Yeah.
And so health is the same. We have mothers who give their birth on their way to hospitals because we can't provide enough clinics close enough to population centers because there's just not enough resources.
Yeah.
And I think the climate crisis is hitting us all. And I'm not saying we're worst hit. It's going to hit everybody the same. Everyone's going to be dealing with the consequences. The difference is the capacity to respond and the financial capacity to respond. And that's an issue that comes down to human rights. And we believe that Germany is in a core group with us, and I thank Germany, in developing a text of a resolution to go before the United Nations General Assembly to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, the highest UN body on international law.
Yeah.
And we would like the International Court of Justice to clarify what these legal obligations are. Yeah. Is Vanuatu, can we be penalized because we are not providing children with the right to education, because we cannot afford to, because we are dealing with the effects of the climate crisis, and that's what we're spending our money on?
Wow.
Is Vanuatu liable for that? Because we have signed up to this convention.
Yeah.
Is a developed country which does not align its NDCs with 1.5 and is responsible for overshoot and emissions, is it liable in some way to Vanuatu because it has provided us with this budget cost that we shouldn't have to bear because we are contributing 0.00016% of emissions.
Climate change.
And we are not responsible, but we are paying the majority of our budget towards this end.
Absolutely. And
So the human rights of our citizens are directly affected.
Yeah.
That's why it's so interlinked and cannot be separated.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing that. And I was going to say 15% on just on climate adaptation. And I mean, you explained so eloquently what that means indeed in terms of taking funding away for vital things such as education, healthcare, and it makes it really concrete. Thank you so much for sharing that. I was also able and lucky enough to meet a lot of the young people from Pacific Island states from all over the world that are also advocating very hard for this advisory opinion that the ICJ hopefully will be looking at very soon in the future. In the meantime, Hindu, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for being here. We were just starting, and maybe I can turn to you right away because, as you know, we're speaking a lot about why it is so important that we make this interlinkage between human rights and the climate crisis. Being an Indigenous rights advocate, a women's Indigenous rights advocate, I was really curious to hear from you very briefly. Why would you say that it's so important that we make the interlinkage?
Sure. Thank you very much, and sorry to be late with all this negotiation. Running actually from the loss and damage negotiation who is stuck. So having human rights into the climate negotiation is not an option that we need to have yes or no. For me, it has to be a right-based approach. I'm coming from a community who are underwater. Now, as we are talking, my family are underwater. We have more than 4 generations living in one house because all the rest, half them home are flooded. How are we going to call that? Human rights, of course, because we lost the right to home, the lost right to food, the lost right to education, because if you don't have house, you cannot think by sending your children to school. They lost all the rights that they have to get when they are back home. So it has to be human rights-based approach, absolutely. This is not a negotiations for us. As my brother said here, 1.5 is not an option that we are giving. It is an obligation because actually we are already underwater and under all the drought. Yeah. So what we want as Indigenous peoples, we are talking our land, territories, and resources as commodities. That's why we are not thinking about the human right might be inside all the negotiations or the discussions. Our forests are not a commodities. They are home of the millions of the ecosystems, including the human beings. Our oceans are not just a trading place or night beaches. They are a home of millions of the species, and it is also an identity of the communities that are living there. When we talk about the loss and damage, it is not the issue of, okay, let us be solidarity with you and just it is a pity. It is not the issue of the pity. It is the issue of the human rights who benefit from climate and who must pay to those who are impacted by the climate. So that's why for us, human rights-based approach must be the first one in all the texts of the negotiations. Let me give you the examples. when we are talking now about the cover decisions, it's all nice. But why we have to argue that in the discover decision, we want to have human rights and indigenous people rights? It has to be naturally, normally. Then it has to cover all the rest of the text by having human rights there. So I think for me, the human rights-based approach must be the basic and the pillars of these negotiations here.
Absolutely, and I love how you said it's not the issue of pity, but it's the issue of human rights that is the core focus. Thank you so much for sharing that, Hindu. Richard Piercehouse, yes, we can applaud for that. Thank you. Thank you indeed. Richard, if I can turn to you, I read an article that you wrote in the lead up to COP27, and there was a part in it where you said, and I quote, the debate amongst diplomats at COP27 over whether ambitious climate policies or protecting human rights should come first presents a false dichotomy. Robust climate policies require robust engagement from civil society. Climate action needs more critical voices, not fewer. Would you like to elaborate on what you meant behind that?
Thank you, Hajat. Thank you, Minister, fellow panelists, and thank you to the federal government of Germany for providing this very important platform for these discussions at this particular COP. This place is a very important place, and it's an obligation to use it as well as possible. So I'd like to begin just by two remarks. One is a remark of recognition to my colleagues at HRW who are Egyptian human rights activists and who can't speak here themselves because they would face a ban and imprisonment if they did so. And the second is to reiterate a call that has been made frequently throughout this COP for the freedom of a British Egyptian prisoner of conscience, Alaa Abdel Fattah, who has been imprisoned arbitrarily by the Egyptian government for spreading information on Facebook, for spreading false news, undermining national security. I think there is a general trend, perhaps vocalized, perhaps implicit in some minds, that these human rights issues that human rights organizations and others continue to raise are somehow a distraction from the real game, the real issue, which is the climate crisis. And if we genuinely understood the climate crisis, we would reprioritize and focus on ambition in the climate negotiations. I want to spend just a couple of minutes to interrogate that view. One of the things that we did when we, in preparation for this conference, was research into Egypt's domestic environmental activism. Because it's been known for a long time that Egypt is a human rights black hole. The precise and exact nature of the repression from the Egyptian government on Egyptian environmentalists has not been well understood. And what we found by interviewing people anonymously, because they all who spoke to us would precondition their information being on a guarantee of anonymity, was that the space for environmental activism inside this country where this conference is being held is severely curtailed. It's curtailed by constant harassment by intelligence and security forces, by the difficulties of travelling through Cairo airport, by restrictions on NGO registration, on receiving foreign funds, and by research permits to conduct environmental research. Now, what that means is that important independent environmental debates inside this country cannot take place. What are those no-go areas domestically? They are environmental harms linked to businesses, to agro-industry, and to the industries that are run by Egypt's military, such as cement factories, water bottling plants, and stone quarries. They are also any criticism or environmental criticism of large national infrastructure projects, such as the construction of a new administrative capital here in Egypt. And perhaps most importantly for this conference, they are discussions around Egypt's energy mix and the fact that in the middle of 2014, Egypt reintroduced coal on the behest of its heavy industries and is currently expanding oil and gas, particularly methane gas, domestically. So those are the types of issues that can't be talked about domestically and have almost no presence, the platform of Germany withstanding, inside these conferences. And for those that think that human rights and this question of civic space is a distraction from climate ambition, I would ask you to consider how we are going to generate, at both the national and international level, the types of robust climate policies absent environmental activists, NGOs, environmental journalists, and environmental researchers.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Richard. So that is really what you mean with that false dichotomy. They are not mutually exclusive, and we should always be talking about, this importance of critical voices within, any discussion, really, frankly, that we could be having anywhere. Thank you for that. Now, Minister Baerbock, I know you have to leave in a bit, but I actually wanted to ask you a quick question before you leave, because you already mentioned that you've assumed the office a year ago. In the meantime, you have visited many places around the world, and I really wanted to hear from you before you leave. What would you say that inclusive and a human rights-based climate action approach would look like?
Well, first of all, this is also my experience from almost the first year in office. If you set a goal and then people always say, well, now you pass below the goal. This is dangerous because we formulated foreign climate policy, feminist foreign policies, and then if you're not able or willing anymore to formulate goals because everybody's just saying, but you now pass below the goal. Yeah. I think then we are being thrown back years because nobody tried to actually be ambitious or actually say this is a path we have to go. So this is why I'm a bit reluctant here, and anyhow I would say democracies are living societies. There's never a goal of a democracy. Democracy never ends. So also the question about when have we reached the real combination between human rights and solidarity and climate, probably never, because also in 70 years when hopefully we live in a climate neutral world and a world without fossil energy, we still have to face, and this is a reality, because we are now living in a 1.1 degree world, and hopefully then it's not a world over 1.5, but we have to deal also then with the consequences of the actions we are taking now. So if you say, when are we there? We are obviously there when we are not emitting any more CO2. Yeah. Then we at least fulfilled the Paris Climate Agreement, and I hope that we're also there when we can say what my colleague von Tuvalu said, that it's not those countries or those society who pay for the price of global warming by education or by other means, that those are paying for this who actually were the perpetrators in this regard. And you said, I think very rightly, it's not a question of pity, but of human rights. I would say yes, and it's also a question of justice. So the question of climate justice, and you were mentioning treaties, I think is really, really crucial. And this is something we are working on it also as a foreign office. You were mentioning the question of the international court, who has to pay actually in the end. There's another initiative which is highly important. I believe this is a Nansen initiative, initiative. So if people have to resettle, maybe leave their home, leave their country, so what is their citizenship? And this is topics we have to discuss right now, because we cannot say in 2030, oh, unfortunately we didn't discuss it, and now these people are stateless. So this is where my ambition goes, that we broaden our picture also with regard to convention, with regard to human rights convention, including the results of the climate crisis altogether. And I'm very sorry that I have to leave now, but the event you just came from, because we are also highly engaged in loss and damage, and this is where I have to go right now, also with our facilitation talk. So thank you very much for the discussion, and thank you also to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Minister Baerbock, and best of luck with the negotiations.
Maybe before you leave, I send you a letter about the loss and damage that I wanted to give you, officially handle it to you, the letter of loss and damage. More than 1,400 people signed it on it. So I know you are busy, but I hope that I will find you, and then you can give me time to give you these signatures coming from the citizens, not the negotiators.
Thank you very much. And I think we are fighting on the same front here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And in the meantime, we see that we have a new guest in our midst. Please do sit, because I would like to give a very warm welcome as well to State Minister for Europe and Climate, Anna Loerman. Thank you so much for being here. Can we also get a big round warm of applause for State Minister Loerman? We're very happy to have you joining here in our discussion. I'm really looking forward also to hear your perspectives on this interlinkage between the climate crisis and human rights. So yeah, definitely be going to you as well in a bit. I just quickly want to go also to you, Minister Vanuatu, because Minister Baerbock just also touched upon the advisory opinion for the ICJ, and you mentioned it before. Hindu, you so eloquently said it's not an issue of pity, it's an issue of human rights, and we added just now, it's an issue of justice. From that perspective, what is the weight and the importance that this advisory opinion could have for the road towards a human rights inclusive climate approach?
We're here at these negotiations, and it's quite frustrating.
Yeah.
It's very disappointing. We're hopeful. The developing countries, the Pacific Island countries, we always come here in good faith to try and negotiate the best outcomes. It's our survival. I think we need more legal clarity to help us find our way through these negotiations, and that's really the point of this advisory opinion. We have the young people actually came up with the suggestion that Vanuatu took forward to the Pacific Islands Forum and elevated until the stage it's at now, where we have the support of Africa, Caribbean, Pacific. Germany is in the core group with us, drafting the resolution, which I believe will be completed today in New York. I hope to announce on Friday with the core group the actual zero draft of the resolution. The President of the General Assembly has set a date in December or January when the vote will go forward, and we very much hope and believe that it will pass. And then the International Court of Justice will have to sit and determine the question. I imagine it'll take years. There'll be submissions from various countries, stakeholders, civil society. Everyone can make submissions to the court. But at the end of the day, the question is, what are the legal obligations of states? We're not talking about companies or anyone else. We're talking about states.
Yes.
And within the UN system, within the Charter of International Cooperation between states for the common good, we're talking about human rights conventions, we're talking about the Paris Agreement, we're talking about the law of the sea, we're talking about Convention on the Rights of the Child. What do all of these obligations that we have all signed up to, what are the things we need to be clear on in terms of what we are obliged to do? Right. What are our obligations to other states? What are the obligations to our citizens? And we just hope that, we believe that this will provide an extra tool for clarity, both in terms of our own legislation in our own countries. It'll provide clarity in terms of coming to these negotiations.
Absolutely.
And also it'll be obviously advisory opinion from the ICJ is not a binding judgment on anybody, but it's a very persuasive legal argument that can be used in all fora across the world and
as you
everywhere.
say, it's such a catalyst to have that discussion about indeed what is the responsibility that is being bared by states, and how do we look at it? How do we look at this question of justice? So definitely, thank you so much also for all the hard work being put in there. State Minister Lohrmann, if I can turn to you, because well, you've been listening in on this discussion already, the dialogue. We've been talking about the interlinkage between human rights and the climate crisis. I want to hear from you if you have any perspectives on, do you think that human rights could help make more climate ambitious actions, policies, so to say?
Yeah, definitely, and there's clear scientific evidence on that as well, because it is clear that open societies where human rights, where freedom of speech flourishes, are societies where citizens can raise concerns about climate issues, about climate justice, and then push governments to take action on it. And the scientific evidence I'm talking about are really a lot of studies that found a clear correlation between ambitious climate policies of governments and the level of freedom of respect for human rights in their societies. So there's this clear link, and I think we can also see it also in very practical examples. No? I mean, if you just look at the pressure civil society movements around Fridays for Future, for instance, could formulate and could put on politicians during the last years, the last decades, I mean, this has really sort of pushed this whole issue to the center of global attention, and thus we really need free societies and an active and vibrant civil society to push this issue. You've also raised several examples here. What happens when these kind of issues cannot be raised in a society, then they are not addressed properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. And that is also provides perspective, right? That it can increase the ambition of these actions so much more. Hindu, I want to turn to you. I mean, we have people watching online. We have people here in the hall. We've been speaking about this. Would you have any recommendation, or what would you say is the most important recommendation you would have to accelerate climate action or the nexus between human rights and the climate crisis?
I think the first right to recognize in this COP is right to speak. Because most of the people who are coming here, how many that have the right to go to the negotiation room and speak the voice of the millions of people who are back home? So the negotiators, yes, it is country driving. But we are talking about actions. We are talking about our people who are dying back home. So we must get the right of the decision making. Sitting in the tables and speaking. This is the first thing who have to be happen. The second, I think in those negotiation texts, we don't want to hear about the argument of remove the language of human rights. We want to have the argument of add the language of human rights, because if there is no wording of human rights in the text, the people who are going to be back home implementing, they are going to do the greenwashing, removing people from their land and just implementing the things for their own economy, not respecting the right of peoples. That's why we need this safeguard in all the decision making, in all the documents that are coming from the COP. And then the last one is how we can create a safeguard during the implementations of all the decisions that we are taking.
Yeah.
It has to be implemented by the peoples, with the peoples, and by respecting the right-based approach at home.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you indeed. We can applaud for that. State Minister Lohrmann, I saw you nodding quite vigorously as Hindu was speaking. Would you perhaps like to reply?
No, totally, because this is exactly what needs to happen. I mean, it's people on the ground, it's civil society that needs to hold the negotiators to account when they get back home, and then ask the questions and push for implementation. And this is why we're here, and this is also why we negotiate here now a lot for a very ambitious mitigation work program, because it's all about implementation, about concrete steps. And then we need to go back home and implement it, and also take everyone with us, right? I mean, because we need to change everything, right? We don't only need to change the policies on the paper that we decide on in a parliament, nice resolutions, but we need to change the way we work, the way we get to work, the way we produce, we cook, we produce energy, So it's really everything, and so also everyone needs to be on board, and we need strong voices to hold governments to account. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if I listen in here, I do hear this recurring mentioned importance of the inclusion of voices. And it's the point you also raised earlier, Richard. So perhaps if I can turn to you, because I'm quite curious to hear from you. I know that Human Rights Watch also calls on governments and others to act boldly and quickly, especially to address this environmental human rights situation that we're in. What do you see as the biggest challenge in the pursuit to addressing this? And what would you say that needs to happen to overcome these challenges?
Thank you for the question. It's incredibly broad. I don't think there's one issue. I think I am dismayed at the ease with which human rights have been relegated from the discussion as though, as I mentioned before, they were somehow a distraction from the real issue. And I think I've sort of shared perspectives on that. I think that what's being built here in the technical discussions around in this COP and other COPs is essentially an international architecture for how the emissions can be ramped down over time. But keep in mind that whatever is discussed here, and there does need to be far more discussions around the human rights language inside the construction of the international architecture, a lot of those decisions take place at the national level, right? And so the ambition is usually reflected in national level NDCs. And so what this structure does is put the pressure back onto the domestic situation. And I find it terrifying that many countries are assuming that we can have more ambitious national policies, but don't want to discuss the human rights context in which those policies are supposedly to grow and flourish. So it's been mentioned that, that civic space is important because it drives urgency. People on the streets is an imperative to showing the politicians that this is a genuine concern, that there is a need for acting. I would also highlight the role of the courts. That one of the pieces of good news in this space is the ability to hold governments and sometimes corporations to account for insufficiently ambitious climate policies. But again, the question becomes, if you're facing a domestic situation where the civil rights situation is such that there is not space for protest, there's not space for the people to demand improved policies, and there is no independent judiciary or local organisations to bring those sorts of test cases forwards, we have very few motivators for change. And the other key argument I would say is it's also about testing the policies, because we're moving into a new era when so many of these policies are experimental. And governments around the world are trying to work out what exactly a just transition means. And it's terrifying for us to think about governments trying to do just transition, but without any consideration from civil society and any feedback on civil society. Anyone who's able to sort of raise the red flags and say, that's not going to work in practice, or have you forgotten about this issue in your just transition plans? So again, just transition is another place where you see we're going to have to proof test a lot of the policies that politicians are making up as they go along. There's a feedback loop from civil society into those policies. Absent civil society or with strong restrictions on civil society, we have a real problem in terms of avoiding inadvertent harms.
Right. Yeah, but it's quite clear indeed. So it's really that inclusion that's both the obstacle, but then again also, in a way, the solution to it, right? To have that self-reflection, which you can only have by, critical voices being present, the broad inclusion, as, we've heard from Hindu about Indigenous, right? Young people, critical voices all around, which has been mentioned, and I think, very much underlined by the other statements. Minister Regan-Vanu, if I can go to you, I actually want to ask you a question of similar nature, because I'm curious here from you. We're not there yet, and we all know that, and you, of all people, you in Vanuatu, you know it because you see it every day, and it's your lived experiences there. What would you say is the biggest obstacle right now for us not being ambitious enough and us not including this human rights-based approach enough in our climate action? And at the same time, how do you think that we can also overcome those obstacles?
It's a big question.
It's a difficult one.
That's the question of the COP.
Yeah.
We've got to have courage. We've got to have courage to change and move away from things we're used to. And change, and for us on the front line, we are having to change. We're moving with our feet, we're living that change. And I think in the developed countries as well, change is happening. Maybe it's not happening fast enough, but I think civil society and young people know that there is the need to change, and that's why you see they're so courageous in their actions to push states and companies. There's a big need to, as Prime Minister Motley said, to reform the financial architecture. But there's a big need also to rein in corporations. And I think that a lot of states are beholden to corporations too much.
Yeah.
The big polluters who are making trillions of dollars of profit right now, where emissions are the highest level ever, it's clearly a problem that states have to deal with as regulators, and it's not happening.
Yeah. Absolutely, that's beautiful, and thank you so much. Courage, I think that's a beautiful one, and I also just want to thank you for, championing this and really underpinning that importance of the inclusion of young voices, in particular in your case. I think that is vital to what we need. Now, I made a promise at the start that we also, and especially want to hear from you. You've all been listening as well to everything that's being said here. So I really want to hear from you guys, the audience, any questions that you have for our panelists. Now, since we are in large numbers, I want to make sure that we can get to as many questions as possible. So that is why I will ask you to ask one question, tell us who it is addressed to, and please, let's ask questions and not give statements. Do it also for your fellow audience members, because then they also have room to ask their questions, because I'm sure that with all the insights that have been shared, you might have many of them. So is there anybody who'd like to start off with the first question in the audience? Can I see? I see a hand over there. Yeah? You want to go ahead? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I first of all want to second the last statement that was made, that really corporations have to be reined in. I think that's super important. And I would like to give that back to the German side, because I think from a German point of view, it's really interesting that we have heard a lot of how climate change threatens people around the world, threatens communities, threatens livelihoods. And then we see that the energy transition, which is key to our mitigation ambition in Germany, is just still lagging what is really needed. So my question is, how can you in Germany really ensure that our mitigation ambition is in line with saving these communities and preserving these human rights of threatened people in communities around the world?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. State Minister Lohrmann, is it okay if I point it to you?
Of course, obviously. Thank you so much for this question. And indeed, this is the key, and this is our also moral responsibility to do everything we can to get our emissions down. And this is also the goal of this government. We want to be carbon neutral by 2045. And we've just done several measures to actually speed up our climate action. One is that we are phasing out of coal in the western part of Germany already much earlier, by 2030. We are also accelerating the push to renewable energy with I think we've passed 15 different laws and regulations since the start of this government to speed up really the rollout of renewables, so that we can really achieve the greatest part of our energy production by 2030 with renewables already. So this is all we're doing. We're also facing some setbacks. As you know, because the Russian gas was cut, so we had to find some short-term alternatives for this year, this winter, maybe next winter. So unfortunately, we had to repower some coal plants, but this is really only for this very, very, very short and limited time period. And as I said, we're using, at the same time, we're speeding up the transition to renewables, so that really this is only for a transitory period. And it's very clear that in order to stay within the budget for the 1.5 degree limit, whatever we pollute more now will have to be cut and then in the years after. So we actually have to have a steeper emission reduction path afterwards. And that's also why we moved the international climate policies to the Foreign Office, because we really want to put climate action at the heart of every government policy. So in every ministry, in every aspect of what we're doing, we're trying to cut emissions, to cut energy consumption, and this includes also agriculture, and I could go on and on, but
thank you, and thank you also for raising the question. I think it's an important one. Another question from the room that we have for our panel, I see over there, on the left.
Is this working with the mask? Okay, thank you so much. So the minister said earlier she appreciates critical civil society, so here comes a critical question. I think that we should, before we talk about human rights elsewhere, also talk about human rights at home, and I see a lot of white German climate advocates here, but we have like 26% Germans with migration background. We have a huge Afghan community in Germany. We have people with disabilities. We have refugees who actually flee to Germany from the climate crisis. And my question would be, where are they represented here? Just valuing human rights at home before we talk about it elsewhere, and truly valuing indigenous voices that are here also in the loss and damage negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Perhaps State Minister Lohmann, but maybe also Richard, if you want to respond in a bit as well on like this, this sort of a broader impact, if you're comfortable with it. But otherwise, also very free to our other panelists to respond. But maybe State Minister Lohmann, if I could briefly go to you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that protecting human rights needs to start at home, and indeed we have quite some homework to do in Germany as well. We have to do homework when it comes to full gender equality. This is still, I can cite the numbers of female members of parliament, for example. We have to do, in particular, our homework when it comes to discriminatory practices. That's why we have, for the first time as government now, an anti-discrimination special envoy, sort of, to really make sure that we go also again through all aspects of life in Germany to make sure that it's less discriminatory. When it comes to civil society, maybe we can also start a conversation about that afterwards, but sort of I think my role as a government representative is more to enable a space for civil society. Of course, when we invite people to speak here at the Pavilion, of course, we can look at who we invite. But when CSOs themselves send people, they have to choose them, I think. So maybe it's indeed a question to Richard then also.
Yeah, if you're comfortable with it. But otherwise, because I saw you do the little hand. Would you?
I wouldn't want to opine on the representation of Germany here at this COP. I do think it's something that we're seeing that we're increasingly needing to challenge inside the environmental space as well, right? The way in which policies may sound good on paper, designed from people with a very particular background and reflecting a very particular worldview. And I would encourage us all to be far more open and listening to diverse views inside our own forms of environmentalism. I think there's a lot to be learned as well as spoken about in those spaces. And I also think that in our frantic search for solutions in the climate space, I'm worried that there is a particularly Western tech-driven form of getting in there to fix it, which is really quite tone deaf and at times abusive of local communities and local populations. I think that's a sort of a mode of thinking about the environment. I know it's not your question, but it is an invitation to interrogate the forms of environmentalism that we put forward as solutions to the climate crisis.
Yeah, and it's a good one. And I think, if I may say that, but I think it does touch at some of the core of what you're saying is the importance of getting those other voices in, because otherwise, if it's not representative, then, is it going to be carried very broadly, and is it a representation of the voice out there? Thank you also for raising a critical question. Is there another question? Yes? Maybe we can go there first, yeah?
Yes, that's good, because I want to reiterate the question of this person before. Because for now, you've just made an advertisement for the policies that are already there, but we know that Germany is not meeting its climate goal, and we know we have studies that the early phase out of coal in 2030 doesn't actually Sorry, I'm thinking in German, but it doesn't actually make a difference in terms of emissions. So what still needs to be done? That's the question.
Yeah, good question. State Minister Lohrmann, back at you.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot more. I mean, we can be more ambitious. We need to be more ambitious in our climate targets. I mean, this is also the spirit of the Paris Agreement to increase the level of ambition at all times. One of the things that we're doing in the EU together is also the Fit for 55 package. And as Commissioner Timmermans has said yesterday, we also, through the support of Germany, we managed to make it so ambitious that we will actually probably be able to achieve 57% more of reductions.
Okay.
And then I think in particularly we need to do more homework when it comes to the heating sector. Here still a lot more needs to be done. And all the Germans here know what I talk about. The transport sector is sort of the issue, the sector we worry most about. And you also know that there are a lot of proposals on the table to have less emissions when it comes to cars. For example, to drive slower. That don't have a majority at the moment, unfortunately, but that we need to fight for.
Right. I think the point indeed being made is, will it, however, be enough when we sum it all up? And we've also been talking about some of the complexities, and I mean, this is what this entire conference is about, but maybe if I can go to you, Minister Regenvan, also with regards to that question. We all know how vital it is that we stay under 1.5 degrees, yet we're not there, and most of us are not there, but we need to be there. How do we deal with that discrepancy, because the time is ticking, and how can we sort of wrap our minds around that we're not there yet?
Well, we know the science. I mean, I think from my perspective, from the developing countries' perspectives, from the small island states' perspective, at the very least, we need to stop planning new fossil fuel projects.
Yes.
Like, it's inconceivable to me that we are still planning new fossil fuel extraction projects next year, the year after, the year after. We know that that's not on the right path, but countries are still planning it.
Yeah.
Countries who are here talking about high ambition. And so, there's a just transition of what you're using now, but don't create new projects.
Yeah, because we know that we cannot have any new licensing, or it will be very hard. Hindu, I saw you nodding. Do you want to come in here?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what he said. Countries need to be honest with themselves. It's nice to give a nice talk that people can just say, yes, it's fine. But in the reality, it's not true. Just they are not being honest with themselves. They are going to another country. How many Western countries are going to African countries to search for the gas, for the oils? It's not changing the place that are mitigating the climate. It's stopping in all the planet. It is one planet. Subsidizing fossil fuel around other places is not going to help us. The banks that are paying continuously for the company who are digging the fossil fuel, they are not helping us to get 1.5. So we have to be honest with what we are saying. If we are ambitious, we have to stop fossil fuel at home, but also in other people's home. It is not an issue of just changing and saying we are ambitious or doing it. Do it for the real. That's what we are waiting for to get the 1.5.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much all for coming in there. Thank you. I saw a hand over there that's been up for some time.
Thank you very much. When we talk about human rights, the topic of gender equality and gender justice especially was mentioned as well. And Minister, you also talked about it in regards to the panel on Monday on feminist foreign policy, talking about gender equality. So I was wondering, how can it be then that Germany doesn't have a gender focal point here present at the gender negotiations, that on one day there was the Gender Day actually, and here at the German Pavilion there was no space for such an event to raise the topic of gender justice, even though so many panels actually addressed the topic. So when it comes to feminist foreign policy and the importance of gender, how can we actually, truly uphold it and actually represent that here at the conference as well? Thank you.
Thank you. State Minister Lohmann, I feel like I have to buy you a box of chocolates after this event because I'm just coming back to you every time. But yeah, very clearly directed to you if you want to come in. And Hindu, maybe in a bit if you want to respond, because I know you also work a lot on, indigenous people, but also on women's representation. So yeah, it would be good to get you in as well.
But thanks a lot for this question. I mean, this is, I'm learning from the engagement with civil society. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. This is what needs to happen. Because I personally actually wasn't aware that we don't have a gender focal point here. So thanks for raising that, and I'll certainly follow up on that. I really wasn't aware of that. And I mean, here in the German Pavilion, I mean, we have really focused a lot of our events and discussions on human rights. I'm not sure what the plan was for the day that we're focusing on gender. I mean, as you said, I personally was participating in another pavilion in an event on feminist foreign policy. So I think that was an important way to raise this issue. And then also, I mean, in this event, we actually talked a lot about that. One of the ways we also need to incorporate the gender action plan here in the climate negotiations is by bringing more women to the negotiation table. And I can definitely say that we have achieved that in the German team. I mean, the German team is headed both by our foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, by Jennifer Morgan, the special envoy on climate, and then at least 2-3 other very senior people in the negotiating team are women. So we really are bringing forward those perspectives. And we have also made quite some suggestions on including gender-sensitive indicators, for example, in action plans and budgets. So I think that's from the policy side.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hindu, do you want to add anything to that? Maybe
quickly to do not let you respond to all the questions. It is not only Germany that who do not have a gender focal point. Many countries who are present here, they must have a gender focal point, because we cannot have just a woman as checking box. We cannot have how many women we have in the panels. We wanted to have women that can raise the issues, that can be listened. We wanted the women who can take the decisions. So let us make it not only for one country, but for all the negotiators. Women are the most impacted, but women are acting. They are the solution makers. So let us have the women as just participating in a right way. In the next agenda that we are going to have maybe in the COP28, we wanted to see Germany championing that, but also many other countries that championing during the Gender Day, during the Indigenous Women Days, and we can all stand together and say women are doing the solution together.
Nice, thank you so much. Yes, please guys. Thank you for bringing in that energy together, the both of you, and thank you for raising the question. I think it's a very important one. Now, I actually want to go to the last question from the audience, at least. I see that there is somebody standing very conveniently right next to Thomas, so please do.
Okay, Mrs. Lohmann, you just mentioned that there is no majority for speeding limit. I doubt it, but I would like to ask you, Mrs. Ibrahim, and you, Mr. Regen Vanu, I believe it's a low-hanging fruit, this speed limit. Can you accept in this overall scope that we're discussing that we are not harvesting this low-hanging fruit to implement a speeding limit in Germany to reduce CO2? How do you see this discussion from your perspective?
Okay, interesting question. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Regen.
I need more information on the question.
I think it's to do with the speed limit on the highways that cars can drive, and I think if I understand you correctly, it's something that we could fairly easily implement and do, and we're not doing it, and it could reduce CO2 emissions. So yeah, I think you want their perspective on what Germany should be doing.
If you like, I can start. Actually, I'm laughing because I know many people around Europe, if they wanted to speed their car, like, let's go to Germany, there is no limit. No, seriously. And most of the people that I find arrested in France, in another country, when they're speeding, they just say like, oh, I'm coming from Germany, and then like there is no limit there.
Yeah.
Like, come on, it's very easy to just like come up with a law, say just limit your speed that can limit all the greenhouse gases. It could be also a response for the developing world who are impacted to the climate change from our side to understand that you are doing the basic one, maybe you can do the difficult one. If you are not implementing the basic one, who is very easy, how are we going to trust you that you are going to limit all the greenhouse gases in general?
Thank you, yeah. And quite clear. Quite clear. If I hear you, Hindu, I hear you loud and clear. Go for that low-hanging fruit and do implement these things. Very recognizable what you said. I live in the Netherlands, so I know the excuse people use when they are stopped by the police and are driving just a little too hard than what they should be doing. Richard, do you want to come in there?
I did want to come in and just to add a little bit, not to talk about the specifics of German speeding limits, but I did want to, because so many of the questions have been addressed to the German ministers, and rightly so, on the particular nature of climate policies and ambition. I think that's well understood. I did want to, on behalf of Human Rights Watch, say a very sincere thank you to the German federal government for creating a space here in close collaboration with German civil society organisations, for creating a space here to talk about some of the incredibly important issues that my colleagues and I say by that I mean Human Rights Watch, but other human rights organisations, have been insisting that are on the agenda for COP27. When I'm asked, well, surely governments have to choose between, climate ambition and the human rights issues. Surely it must be uncomfortable to have to raise some of the human rights concerns at the same time as negotiating for climate ambitions at Egypt. I think the answer has been no. You need to do both of those things at the same time as talking about the civil and political crisis in this particular country and in other repressive regimes. It is possible to negotiate for improved and more ambitious climate policies. And so, as one of the governments who has understood that there is not a separation between those two worlds, and that it is possible to do those two things at the same time, I wanted to extend my thanks.
Okay, thank you indeed. Yeah. And I think those are actually nice words to conclude the Q&A with the audience with, and which almost actually brings us to the end of the event. But before we do that, I actually want to go back to all of you just once more, very briefly. So it's like a quick fire, rapid round of questions, because we are almost at the end, actually, of the second week of COP, which means that we are almost at the end of COP27. Now, a lot has been discussed here in this conversation, in this dialogue with each other. A lot has been discussed in the hallways, in the negotiation rooms where, Hindu, you were just in, and in all that has been happening around here. Of course, we all know that the work doesn't stop when we go back home, when we go back to our daily work offices and dive back into, the everyday sort of work. So I just want to hear from you. What needs to happen now, once we're back home from COP26? What is the first thing that you will do, or the first thing that you would say that people need to do to really make sure that we can have ambition and solidarity, that we can have a human rights-based climate approach? Just to switch things up, I will not start with you, State Minister Loerman, but perhaps Minister Regenvano, if I can start with you, and just very briefly, if you will.
When I leave here, I'm going to be campaigning for all member states of the United Nations to support the resolution to the ICJ.
Amazing.
And I very much hope that the countries here hear that and support it. So we start to go to a process to clarify some of our obligations under international humanitarian law, under international law. It's so important that we strengthen the international regime, especially now. Yeah. And let's do it together as states.
First one, the advisory opinion at the ICJ. Thank you. Hindu, would you like to answer? The first thing that needs to happen.
The first thing needs to happen here, actually, for me. If I go back home, it's not going to make sense attending here. The first thing is this COP must deliver on human rights-based approach, full stop. And when I go back home, I can assure my family who are underwater that maybe, your right will be respected.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, indeed. Richard?
First of all, I will encourage my colleagues to sleep. There's been a lot of work to get here.
Also
for all of us.
important, yeah.
I think there's a real need for a strong human rights agenda on mitigation, and by that I mean building out the human rights case against fossil fuels and for the phase down of fossil fuels, and building out the human rights case for limiting deforestation. And then turning to some of the emerging challenges to that need for urgency. By that I mean carbon offsets markets and the need to have human rights protections to those. So those are three things on our agenda.
Okay, thank you so much. And then State Minister Lohrmann, not to start with you, but to end with you, what is for you the first and most vital thing you will do?
For me, the top priority in Germany at the moment is that we all cut down energy consumption.
Right.
Because that's,
saving energy. Okay, thank you. That's quite clear. Thank you so much. I think those are some concrete, tangible things, important things as well. So thank you so much for raising them, for sharing your insights. I also want to turn to you, our audience, brilliant audience. Thank you for your questions, critical questions, important questions. I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Also to our online audience for making the time to join in on this discussion. Of course, as has been mentioned by you in that last round, the work does not stop here. So I really do hope that everything that has been shared here about human rights and the climate crisis, about bringing them together, I hope you will bring that into your work every day, any day after this conference. And I just want to say a big thank you to all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thanks to you. Thank you.